Hello everybody, I'm here to talk about contractual abstractions for economic activities. So what it is we've been looking at some ways of extending the REA concepts from transactions to agreements more generally, and in particular contractual agreements or contracts. We'll look at three parts of that: contracts, the commitments that those exchange, and the relationship between commitments and actions. We look at a number of possible ways of delivering things. So there's rights and availability and things themselves. And then we extend the notion of offerings, of commitments, to talk about offerings by extending commitments to conditional commitments, and look at various different ways in which contracts can be entered into. And the ambition for this is to come up with a framework for being able to have a kind of ontology-driven set of modular smart contracts. So I'll give a little hint as to where that work might go. So that's the ambition. There is, you've got the smart contracts idea. The particular one that we're looking at here is the IOTA smart contracts that's just been released in alpha, and that's a very modular arrangement, and it has the additional benefit that you have various level 2 protocols, as they're called, things like streams of encrypted messages that can be linked together within particular business contexts. Those can be set on top of a distributed ledger, such as a blockchain or a tangled graph ledger. And you also have oracles that could also have information that's more publicly available that could be posted to those. So what we're thinking is, okay, what does it take to create a set of ontologies that could drive a set of discrete distributed applications to cover the whole space between offerings, agreement, and fulfillment? So to do that, we first look at extending the REA ontology. This is a very simplified view of the way we modeled REA in the VMBO conceptual framework, taken a few liberties with it, but we have the core notion of an economic transaction. It's subject to economic resources. It has the two sides of the transaction, which we describe as economic events. That there are commitments that are conferred by the agreement, and you have parties to the agreement and thereby to the commitment as well. So what we thought about was, well, if you look at a commitment in REA, you can measure differences in commitments in terms of claims and things, because those are always the kinds of commitments that can be evaluated in monetary terms and that can be executed in terms of some transaction. So what we were wanting to do is come up with the most general kind of commitment that could be any kind of commitment. It could be a commitment not to keep pets in an apartment, or it could be a commitment to carry out some act, or any commitment at all, basically, to be the kinds of commitments that are exchanged in agreements. So it simplifies things a little bit between the transaction as it is covered by the agreement and focusing on the agreement itself. So we've added these two levels of indirection for the executable commitment, the evaluatable commitment, and then any kind of commitment at all with its parties and all those various aspects of it. So this is the beginnings of an ontology that we started putting together a couple of years ago. Now, what we're trying to do now is to extend that a little bit to cover the whole kind of economic scenario between offerings, agreements, and the fulfillment of those agreements, which will include but not be limited to what we normally think of as transactions, and set these on top of your normal foundational kind of ontology for business entities and parties and quantities and so on. So let's have a quick look at some of the three parts of that. In the middle there we have the agreement part, the basic REA concepts, and those are divided into structural and behavioral. So in upper ontology terms, we have the partitions of continuant and occurrent, or endurant and perdurant, and that allows us to start talking about things that happen as well as things that are. So that's your events and processes and so on. And the key thing about commitment is that a commitment is a commitment to act. It might be a simple act like delivering something or making some payment, or it might be a whole complex sequence of actions in a service or something. So every commitment has an obligor, the one who's obliged to do that commitment, and that's the same as the actor in the activity. Now, acts, we think about verbs being like transitive or intransitive verbs, and in linguistic terminology, they talk about the agent and patient. I've now learned that that's actually relates to the syntax, and in terms of the semantics of the linguistics, those are the actor and the undergoer, so that wasn't in my paper. But we have these different kinds of acts, and we can subclass acts along multiple kinds of classification facets. We can talk about productive acts that produce something. You can have an act that has a undergoer and produces something. That could include a delivery act for part of your transaction. And the key thing is that for every way that you can classify acts, you can have a corresponding classification of the kinds of commitments that are commitments to those acts. So you really have these two potential parallel taxonomies. It would be ideal if you could have some heritability there to say that, you know, for each new distinguishing feature of an act, we have the corresponding commitment. So that's the core of our model. Now, let's look at delivery terms, what it takes to fulfill, so to discharge or fulfill, close out one of those commitments. And we divide fulfillment into three parts. This is based on the work by Hruby and Schiller fairly recently, that the delivery side can be in terms of things, in terms of rights, and in terms of availability. Rights would include things like ownership rights, so you can actually separate out the commitment to deliver custody of the thing and the commitment to deliver title of the thing. And some kinds of contract might be for rental, for example, where there's custody without title, and so on. So we have this hierarchy of kinds of economic resource in terms of things, rights, and availability. Could be money, delivery, and so on. And there's always some specification that will formally specify what that is. So then in terms of a value chain, whatever is exchanged between different actors in the value chain can be described as this REA contractual interface, whether it's time and materials, energy, raw materials, or whatever. And in fact, we can look at the different ways those are conceptualized. So we often talk about services as being defined as sets of activities, but really how we do that service internally by activities is different from how you're billing for it. And actually the conceptualization by which you bill for something is the ontology, because ontology is, we never know the real things. We have a conceptualization of things, and that's our way of describing an endpoint of a service, for example, or some physical deliverable, or for certain kinds of service, a kind of maintained state, or we may just bill time and materials. So how we conceptualize that in our billing is at the level of this interface what it is, no matter how you've defined it internally. So that means you can have service as a facility, you have a contract in which you have the availability of something. And this is often missed in descriptions of services. They may be sets of actions or activities, but they may be just the availability of something. And that's one of those three kinds of deliveries we talked about. So then with that in mind, we can talk about different ways of describing offerings. So we describe a conditional commitment, which can turn into a firm commitment. And commitment itself then is now much more general. It's a commitment to action, but it may not yet be a firm commitment. And the conditional commitment may be conditional on anything, including another commitment. And so your conditional commitment is the promise to conditionally deliver something or money or availability of dial tone or whatever it is. And it's conditional on some other commitment on the part of the other party in terms of money or some other things that they have to do for you. So you can create this very generalized view of, here's somebody with a little lumpy shape of things they want, and various vendors that may have different things like that. And by keeping it that general, we're not dependent on any particular context like contract negotiation or whatever. You have a simple retail scenario where you just pay and deliver and it's immediately a contract. You could have, so that's an invitation to treat, as it's known, where the beneficiary is just some member of the public, or you can have a named beneficiary through some contractual negotiation or some other scenario, tendering or whatever, and it's all basically the same basic model. So you can cover tendering, negotiation, With negotiation, you can talk about the gambits, if you like, things that I will do if you do that. So you can to and fro with those. And you can generalize it completely at large then to have, for example, offerings described in a distributed ledger, matching to that turns into a contract that can also be described in a distributed ledger. And so we can think about how to take the action part of our commitment to act and have some logic that implements it. So you have your ontology with these application-specific extensions, like a kind of domain-specific language, and a corresponding application architecture that we started with, and some transformation between the two, with the specification being the thing that crosses between all three of those things and can be any kind of thing, rights, or availability. And we can even extend that to fancy things like supply chains with side contracts and upstream suppliers and all sorts of things. So thank you for listening, and that's it.